What do you do on Sundays?
We talk about Cate Blanchett, the acting, the costumes, the awards, but mostly the Blanchett of it all.
I'm not acting.
You think this is a love affair?
I saw you, Erica. Meeting in the middle.
This is Sundays with Cate, and I'm your host, Murtada Elfadl. Welcome to Sundays with Cate, the podcast series about the films of Cate Blanchett. Every week, we choose a Cate Blanchett film and discuss it with a guest. This week, we continue our mini-series about Carol. And it is my pleasure to welcome back to the podcast one of my favorite guests, someone whose work I love and admire, someone you've heard before in episodes about Elizabeth and Elizabeth the Golden Age, so it's only fitting that they come back to talk about the other major titular role in Cate's filmography, Carol. Welcome back to the podcast, Izzy from Be Kind Rewind.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure to always have you. I always have so much fun when you are my guest on the podcast. We always have great conversations.
I always have so much fun too. And, you know, to be here for Carol, what an honor. What an honor.
Yes, it is. You know, Todd and Cate and Rooney have honored us with this film. And that's actually my first question to you. Like, everybody I know who runs in my circles, including you, loves this film, and 6 years later, we still love it and talk about it. And I've talked to a few people. This is the first episode I did about Carol. Everybody I talked to loved it and have seen it many times. But I'm like, am I just in my bubble? This film really has the cultural cachet that I think it has. What do you think, Izzy?
Oh, I certainly think in certain circles, it definitely has a cultural cachet. For sure. I mean, I think I was trying to think about it as, you know, the Carol phenomenon and why people are so drawn to it. And the conclusion that I came to is just that there aren't very many romance dramas anymore that are specifically about sexual desire and how that plays into our definitions of how we define ourselves. And I just think Carol does that in a way that isn't like heavy-handed and isn't it just feels very like magical and grounded in these two characters in a way that just feels so unique, like not even within LGBT cinema, but like just cinema at large right now. And yeah, I just think it really grabs everybody just for that reason, and also because everybody's kind of playing at the top of their game here, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is a very good point that you bring up, because for our listeners, this episode, I'm talking to Izzy about the inspirations and the influences behind Carol. So that's sort of our topic for this podcast. And I went back to look, obviously the movie's set in the 1950s, but it was made in 2015. And so I wanted to see what other big, huge romances kind of that has this thrust of that the romance is the thrust of the narrative. And I couldn't find anything close, like recent. And so, you know, my references, and maybe because that's just my references, but, you know, the first thing I could come up with maybe stuff in the 90s, like The Remains of the Day, or something like The English Patient, those sort of like stories, big, huge, sort of sweeping stories that the romance is the center of the narrative. But can you think of anything recent? So we have to, like, I couldn't.
Yeah, no, I think it's always like the romance is blended with something else to give it sort of a twist on the genre. So like you could think of Shape of Water maybe as a kind of romance, but of course that blends with almost like fantasy and political in a way, if you're thinking about the allegories that he's working with as well. Yeah. Things like that, or like House of Gucci. I don't know. There's technically a romance in that. I mean although it's really not a good one.
The first third is romantic, maybe.
Yeah. But that's what I mean. It's like, there's nothing just exclusively about, oh my gosh, these two people love each other so much and what happens to them because of that love. Yeah. That seems very rare.
Yeah, it is very rare. You absolutely right about that. one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, Izzy, is sort of like, I'm a huge fan of Todd Haynes. I've loved all his movies up until Carol. I think post Carol, I don't like his movies, but we'll leave that for another conversation.
You're not a Dark Waters guy.
I think Dark Waters is sort of like accomplishes what it sets out to be, but I just wasn't into what it set out to be. But like Wonderstruck, I can't abide. But I was thinking of like what drew me in, as a queer man growing up. I've always related to women on screen, definitely not to guys. And so Todd Haynes does that. He gives us these vivid internal lives of women. And, if you think of Safe, if you think of Far From Heaven, even in Velvet Goldmine, the character played by Toni Collette, she's not the lead, but her life is brought out vividly. And so I was thinking this time he gave us two. He gave us Carol and Therese, so he doubled it. And it sort of fits into what he does so well. Like, I think reading interviews during my research to talk to you, he's very proud of that. Like when Carol was released, people were like, oh, this is another one of your women's pictures. And he's like, yes, I'm happy to be known as a women's stories director. Actresses bring me things they're developing, and I love that. And if there is one thing I can be known for, I want to be known for that. So do you like that aspect about Todd Haynes, and does it come out in Carol?
I do. And I actually remember reading a lot of interviews with him around the time that this was released, because there's always that question of like, whose story is a story to tell, right? And so a lot of people were like, is Todd Haynes capable of telling this story? And like, I think that's a really valid question. Obviously, like we should constantly be asking ourselves that when we're consuming and like supporting artists. But in this case, I just think you're absolutely right. I mean, Todd Haynes handles these perspectives with a lot of care and sensitivity in a way that I think has been like largely embraced and validated. And so to me, yes, like I love Todd Haynes, especially early Todd Haynes when he was more experimental. Karen Carpenter's story is amazing.
Yes.
And then also Poison, which I just watched for the first time last year, is just so gorgeous and so creative. The way
done for like $2, it's
incredible. Yeah.
But it looks amazing.
It's beautiful. And it's just so smart. I'd never really seen anything like that before. And so I don't know, when you have someone who's that like intelligent and in tune with just like general human emotion, I think it's very nice that he's applying that empathy and sensitivity to women's stories, because not all male directors do that.
Yeah. And, probably the fact that he's queer helps.
For sure.
And so he has sort of done the 50s in Far From Heaven, and also done the 50s, not just a story set in the 50s, but a story that had queer characters in it, like the character played by, what is his name? Julianne Moore's husband, Dennis
Quaid.
Dennis Quaid.
Yeah.
I
watched it again last night.
You did?
For this. I had a whole binge of
All
things.
Right, you're ready to talk about this.
I'm ready.
So I wanted to sort of like just talk about the characters and the differences between these two movies, because I remember when Carol came out, because it takes place in the 50s, which is the same time period that Far From Heaven takes place, and there was a lot of sort of just knee-jerk reactions from critics who maybe didn't give it a lot of thought and just said, oh, he's doing Far From Heaven again. And I remember like in his interviews, he was always sort of pushing back against that. And, I reread some of his interviews, and he sort of says that Carol is more realistic. It's a love story. It's not a melodrama like Far From Heaven was. And sort of Far From Heaven was a story where he was basically trying to do a Douglas Sirk movie, and doing the artifice of the 50s, of all those melodramas that were made within the studio. Everything is done sort of big and huge and doesn't really seem real. And with Carol, he's doing it more realistic. But also, one of the things that I really love reading his interviews is he says, talking about Carol, that even though it is realistic, unlike Far From Heaven, still naturalism is artificial. It's all artificial. So when you think of those two movies together, where do you see their similarities and their differences?
I mean, I think that there is sort of an aesthetic similarity, not in the sense that he's doing a full Circean, like Technicolor dream, but I was really struck watching Carol again for this because I haven't seen it in maybe like 2 years since last night. I was struck by how he uses color in this movie. Like, it's sort of what you were saying, that it's naturalism, but it's also very artificial. It kind of reminded me of what Scorsese does in The Aviator, where it's sort of like a very intentional callback to the kind of color that was used in cinema history. So like with Carol, you're seeing a lot of greens and reds, and it looks like that kind of two-strip color that you would have seen very early. I mean, pre-50s, but still it just kind of evokes this like historical sense that you're watching something else that is sort of removed from your immediate reality. So I think there is kind of that distance still there, but you're right. I mean, the tone of it is just much more grounded, much more, I think, adhering to the more typical dramas we see today from major studios.
Yeah. And I think even when we look at the performances, and obviously I want to talk to you about both Cate Blanchett and Rooney Mara, but I think when we look at the performances, I always sort of thought of Cate's performance in this movie as not entirely realistic. It's a little heightened. Frankly, I was surprised that they were going for realistic, because I always saw her as she's playing Therese's idea of Carol. She's not just playing Carol. Like, she's always like, every movement is just so perfect. So just exactly as a person seen in somebody who really loves them and looks up to them. Because the camera is really always from Therese's point of view for the most part. So that's kind of my surprise of like, oh, so, Todd thinks of this as realistic, but what about the performance?
Totally. Yeah. I do think, I mean, you're so right. She has that theatricality to her that feels, I mean, never too natural, which I love.
Yeah,
I think it's
too.
great.
Yeah.
But I think it works here because like seduction in reality is like not really sexy. Do you know what I mean? It's like you almost have to perform it in a way that is so next level that it's going to read probably a little theatrical, but you need to be enchanted by it. You need to be seduced.
Yeah.
And doing that realistically is just kind of boring. And it doesn't master the kind of like otherworldliness that Todd Haynes brings to his films. Yeah. So to me, like, this is the perfect marriage of theatricality and like the aesthetic of Todd Haynes, where you're getting kind of angel flung from space, but like no one would ever say that like that. But at the same time, who cares? Do you know what I mean? Like, that's what makes the movie. It's world building is what it is, So I think it works. It works.
And I think it works really well because it's in contrast to what Rooney Mara is doing, which is completely naturalistic. It's very minimal.
She's like a blank slate, right? Yeah. She's the canvas and she's trying to figure out herself as an adult. And so everything that she's doing is just almost wooden because she's just waiting to be like imprinted upon basically by Carol. So exactly. I think like the reason their chemistry works is because we just are basically letting Cate Blanchett do everything until like the last third of the movie.
Yeah, exactly. Rooney Mara as Therese is absorbing everything for most of the movie, to what you were saying, trying to figure out how to behave, trying to figure out what to eat, how to dress, everything. And then, she takes that journey. Before we get into sort of like some of the influences, and I want to talk to you about those, but I just want to go back to the Far From Heaven, Todd Haynes women. Like when we see those movies, there is another Carol in Safe, and there is Cathy Whitaker in Far From Heaven. And, contrasted with Carol and Therese, these are, women dealing with so much. Carol in Safe is having this health crisis. And of course, it's a metaphor. That movie came at the height of the AIDS crisis. Cathy Whitaker is a woman just trying to live, but everybody and everything surrounding her is just closing in on her children, her husband, even her best friend. She can't escape at all. And sort of when you look at those and you contrast them with Carol and Therese, their world is also closing in on them. Like Hard is closing in on them, sending that guy to record them. Rindy is taken away from Carol. Therese's boyfriend doesn't listen to her. So everything is closing on them. But there is a note throughout this movie, and I think this is why I think this is my favorite Todd Haynes movie, is that there is a note throughout it, not just of hope, but of resilience. Like both Carol and Therese are very resilient, very resourceful. And even though everything is closing in on them, they are managing to get out of it. And in the end, they find a way somehow. Like when somebody tells you this story is about two women in the 50s who fall in love with each other, you're going to think it's not going to end this way. It's not going to end with them not just being together, which we don't know if they are together or whatever, but of them being in such a good place. Mm-hmm. Just as two women.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that there's, I have so many thoughts on this actually. I mean, I think obviously this goes back to Patricia Highsmith, mm-hmm. and like the context for that being that a happy ending is only something she could get under an assumed name. Do you know what I mean? Like mm-hmm. nobody would touch that book unless, and especially not her publisher.
Yeah.
Just for its content at that time, which is wild. Yeah. I think what's interesting to me and what I would love to see from Todd Haynes is like a modern woman story, because like, of course, I think Carol and Cathy are very different characters, and mm-hmm. like something that I think connects them, and certainly, Mildred Pierce, for example, is like not only the sensitivity that he's giving them and the concern for what distinguishes women's lives from men's lives, but it's also like he's pointing out that there's a lack of resources to then respond to that difference. And like they are dignified and they are resourceful and they're figuring it out anyway. And I think that's what's really cool. But it's like, to me, I want to see how he interprets that in 2022.
Yes.
Like I just absolutely want to see that from him. Not as like a criticism. I'm just really curious, like how he would portray that, because I think obviously so much has changed since the 1950s.
But there are still things, women need to overcome.
Totally. Yeah. And I think there are really smart things in that screenplay specifically. And obviously that's due to Phyllis. I'm not sure how to say her last name.
Phyllis Naj, I believe.
Naj. Yeah. But especially just like in the way it was adapted, because I actually read the book first. So I think that was interesting for me, like having seen the movie, like the first time I saw it, I was just running through the book in my head and I didn't really even get it. So I had to see it again before I was like, oh no, I really like this.
I mean, the biggest sort of difference between the book and the movie is that the book is entirely from Therese's point of view. And so Carol, to me, was always sort of an elusive object of desire in the book. Like you have to sort of try and find her, and you can never sort of build a complete picture of her, because it's just how Therese sees her and what she's telling us through the narrative. But in the movie, and I think this is, the brilliance of what Phyllis Notch has done, Carol becomes a complete character. And then, of course, we get Cate to play her. And so then, that's two things that are coming that just brings it out. This is where I think the movie sort of is, I'm not saying it's better, but improves on the book.
Yeah. How do you paint a mystery like the book's Carol.
Yeah.
And really, there are very few people who can achieve that. And Cate Blanchett is obviously the one. Like, she was the selection, you know.
Yeah.
It's so well visualized through
Yeah.
her.
And, Cate was like the first person attached to this project even before Todd. And so it was always like whoever the producers, I think it was one of the producers who was behind this project from the beginning, like they saw that, they need to find this, who is the actor who can bring this elusive, otherworldly, sort of perfect but not perfect human to life. And, like you said, there was only one person, and that's Cate.
Absolutely.
So, this movie is to me, like, what I love about it is that it's so heartbreaking from the first scenes. Because, the first time I saw it, or whoever sees this movie the first time is not going to realize how heartbreaking that first scene is. But repeated viewings, and I have seen Carol a lot, it's always just struck me that you start with this complete heartbreak, that interruption. We start with this completely nondescript man in this raincoat walking through the streets of New York, enters, interrupts. You see Cate over there, interrupts them. And then you're like, what's going on? And sort of like by the end, when the movie comes full circle, you're like, fuck, he literally interrupted them as she told her that she loves her. Like,
It's
immediately after.
Yeah. Heartbreaking. Your goal is to never be that person in life.
Yes. And, obviously he's oblivious and doesn't know. But it was very surprising to me to read and know that, at the time when I first saw Carol, I hadn't seen Brief Encounter, David Lean's Brief Encounter. But basically, they stole it from
the shoulder touch. Straight up, like Command C, Command V. Yes. Stole it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, they copied.
And I'm not mad.
No, they copied every. I mean, when it's perfect, why not steal it?
Yeah, it works.
It totally works. But I think what I really love, and what I think, when you can steal something, you have to improve on it, because you have the basics, so you can't just steal it without improving on it. I think it's an inspiration, and they completely stole it, but I think what they improved upon is that they raised the stakes here. Like, they raised the stakes in that, yes, this is a story about these two people in love who are separated and maybe they can't be together. But I think how it improved on it and how the stakes were raised is that they changed the point of view completely. Like, the story in Brief Encounter is just about the Celia Johnson character. It's her story to tell. But here we begin this from one point of view. And when we come back to it, we have seen so many things. And both Carol and Therese have gone through this complete journey. And the power dynamic has shifted. Where at the beginning of the story, Carol holds all the power and all the cards. And when we come back to the scene, she doesn't. Therese has all the power.
Absolutely. And even just from a technical standpoint, I think like the improvement that I appreciate the most in Carol is that it gets you to the past quicker.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's she goes straight from the restaurant to the car and you're right back like at the beginning of their story.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Brief Encounter takes a good 5 or so more minutes before you get back into it. I love that movie though. I mean, I'm not complaining. I truly am not.
I'm not either. I love it. But you're right. It takes a while. Like she has to deal with a lot of sort of like not important things like the husband and the kids.
Yeah, her boring husband. Her boring husband. Yeah. And here we just have Carrie Brownstein, but I guess we don't get to that part till the end.
Yes. But I guess Carrie Brownstein is sort of playing the role of Celia Johnson's husband. Somebody who sort of like makes a comparison point, so then you can make the choice, which I guess Celia can't really make the choice, but Therese does.
Yeah, it's her realizing that she's still desirable, right? Is that that's my read on it?
Yes, that people see something in her, and that maybe she needs to find out what she wants.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to talk a little bit about Brief Encounter. It is a lovely movie, and I haven't seen it. I've seen it like maybe 3 years ago for the first time, and I watched it again yesterday to talk with you, and it's still like so um, brilliant and so moving. And it's one of those sort of movies. Like I always used to think before Carol, like because my reference point was to movies like Dr. Zhivago or The English Patient, which I already talked about, for these big sweeping romances that something had to happen at the end. Even a movie as terrible as Love Story did it. Something has to happen at the end, and the two people who are in love are not going to be together for the sweeping romance to work, to move you. That separation was very important, or at least I thought it was important, to make a romance work. But what Carol does is that it tells us, maybe not.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, a few days ago, so I'm reading the new Greta Garbo book by Robert Gottlieb, which I actually don't love. But anyway, another story.
So listeners, don't get that book.
Just buy one of the other biographies is what I'm saying. It'll be cheaper and you'll learn more. But anyways, so obviously this has caused me to rewatch a lot of her movies. And I recently watched Romance, which is almost, I mean, exactly what you're talking about, right? Like it begins in the quote unquote present. It's an old man. He has a token from this woman that he used to love. And the rest of the movie is like about their relationship. Right. But you're right. It's the same setup where it's always, there was this love and like, maybe it ended positively, maybe it didn't, but the ultimate finale is always that they're not together at the end.
Yeah.
If you're telling it from the past,
yes.
Right? Or from the present, looking back at the past.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting to sort of assume that like nostalgia can be tragic, but it can also be positive in a way. So it was framed that way, at least in Romance. And I can think of a couple of other examples, but
yeah, there are so many, right? Yeah. One thing I want to say about Brief Encounter is that it sort of has this insistence of like they get together and they sort of like the common ground for them is movies. They keep going to the pictures, like that's their escape, which is a thing that maybe in 1946 was new, but I think now it doesn't elicit from me the same like reaction because filmmakers just use it all the fucking time. Like people love movies. Like we know you love movies. You're a filmmaker. You don't have to keep telling me that. But I found it so just wonderful and almost innocent in that they go to the movies, but they don't really love the movies they go see. Like they're always dismissing the movie, but it's about them just having an experience together. So that's kind of one of the things I loved about that, about Brief Encounter.
It's interesting that Todd Haynes kind of returns to the movie theater in Far From Heaven.
Yes.
Where that sort of becomes part of Dennis Quaid's like process as he's kind of figuring out the gay scene. Just thinking about like spaces, like community spaces that you can be drawn to and like not only consume entertainment, but also like culture and figuring out like, these are people together. What are they doing here and why?
Yes.
That's really interesting, especially for him, just because obviously he's a cinephile.
Yes, he is, but he doesn't sort of like, what I like about him being a cinephile is that he does it more in an academic way. Like he sort of shows you his influences and inspirations based on the movies that he loves, but he doesn't sort of do the heavy-handed, here are two characters watching movies and transported, we'll talk Kenneth Branagh is very guilty of that in Belfast. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but I think that's interesting. Kind of, I mean, so one of my favorite plays is Search for Signs of Intelligent Life, which happened to just be on in New York, if you saw that. But I mean, one of the points at the end of it is like watching either a stage play or a movie. It's like there's two things going on here. It's the art, but it's also the audience. And Todd Haynes, I think, is really smart about understanding like, okay, yeah, like I can reference the movies, but this is actually about the audience. And we're thinking about like those people specifically. And I really like that about him.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. And although there is one scene where Therese's friend discusses Sunset Boulevard, but that's also, it's not like they're watching it. They're sort of discussing it away. And I think that's a clever point in the script where he's like, I'm charting what they're feeling versus what they're saying, which is exactly what Carol does. Like these two
Mhm.
women never say what they're feelings. At any time during this movie.
Ever. Yeah. I mean, that is one thing I will give Reef Encounter is like, it kind of illustrates why they love each other in a way that is much clearer and understandable to me than in Carol. Like, listen, if I were Therese, like, no shit, I'd be in love with Carol too. But like, there's not much there. Like, I can't really think of one thing they have. Well, I can think of one thing they have in common, but
Yes. Waterloo.
not a lot. Not a lot. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. In that, what's the commonality between these two characters? Especially, Carol is older, more sophisticated. Therese is sort of like very naive at the beginning. She doesn't know what she wants. And apart from the fact, which is, it sort of brings me to this point that I read in one of the interviews that I sent you, where somebody asks, I think it was Miriam Bale in IndieWire, who asked him about, is this another movie of women copying women? And I thought that was an interesting point because she kind of does copy her. Like even in the way that she dresses at the end, she's copying her. She obviously tries to copy her in like just how to behave and how to be not exactly an out queer woman, but sort of just how to be comfortable with that. But it doesn't really strike me as, Todd Haynes completely sort of refuted that and said it's not really. What do you think, Izzy?
I mean, I don't think it's a mirroring thing in the sense like a Mulholland Drive or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and this is probably informed by the book, but so much of Therese's inner monologues in the book are like basically trying to figure out words. Like there just isn't a common vocabulary, especially in the 1950s, of like to understand how your identity and your personal, how you represent yourself
Mm-hmm.
informs how other people see you and like how you define yourself and all of these things. And like, for example, I remember a part from the book where she's like, well, I can't be a lesbian because lesbians wear pants and like cut their hair short. You know what I mean? Like there's a very simplistic way of looking at all of these things.
Yeah.
That she's trying to figure out. And like her only example is essentially Carol and Abby. Mm-hmm. So it's like, it makes sense to me that there's some sort of mirroring, but it's more part of an internal dialogue that she's having with herself about like who she is and where she fits in the society that's laid out before her. And you kind of see that a little bit in the movie where she sees those two women in the record shop, but obviously it's just much harder to kind of spell out that logic.
But that scene sort of just explains, like she's trying to figure out what is being a queer woman. Like, is it that? Is it Carol? What is it? And it's sort of, to me, the women copying women, it sort of always has sinister undertones. And that's completely like, definitely somebody wants to usurp the other. And, I think of things like Single White Female and sort of like the ilk of it. Like there's so many movies like that. And so the women copying women always to me just feels sinister and not this sort of like loving. I mean, the way Therese looks at Carol, like she doesn't want to do any harm to her. There is no way. It's like the complete opposite of that. Like so much adoration in her eyes.
Totally. Yeah. And like just a side note, actually, because we were, I guess, talking about how they dress and all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Another thing in terms of the color story of this movie that I thought was interesting from a cinematic history perspective was like the amount of red that Carol wears is very interesting to me. And like when Therese wears red is very interesting because like you think of the red dress or like the red letter, the scarlet letter, like this is a color of like sexual scorn or doing something that is considered by society to be bad, and specifically with the sexual connotation. And you think of like Gone with the Wind or like Jezebel or like I mentioned, the scarlet letter. It shows up again and again. You see red lipstick used that way, the same way. And so I think it's interesting that that like she wears a red coat half the movie,
Yes. But not
Yeah.
in a way that, you know, it's just like, it seems as kind of sort of not even that important, right? Because Therese is
No,
so
no, no.
naive. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's meant to be like, oh, we're, a judgment or anything, but it's just, it almost feels like a reclaiming of it because
Mhm.
she is so, I guess maybe proud is the wrong word, but secure, I
Mhm.
guess. Like she becomes hesitant for a bit in the middle there, but she, comes back around.
Mhm.
And then she starts wearing white.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, okay, it's interesting.
Yeah. So what other movies from the 50s or around that time that have been great romances you think maybe inspired or influenced Carol or reminded you of Carol a little bit?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I was thinking about End of the Affair a lot. As anyone who has followed me for the past few months knows, I have a deep, deep love for Deborah Kerr.
Yes.
And and that's another one of those stories where you sort of shift perspective halfway
Mhm.
through the film to like retread different plot points from different perspectives.
Mhm.
And it does not end well, and it's about lost love and all of these things.
Mhm.
But I was thinking about that a lot as a romance and sort of a analogy for like trying to escape a marriage that you don't want.
Yeah.
um
Which is
what
sort of
else?
here in Carol
Yeah.
between Carol and Harge. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, and similar to this and also Brief Encounter, it has nothing to do with the partner really. It's not like there was necessarily an abuse. It's just like you guys aren't vibing. And
Yes.
it's okay to like look elsewhere at this point,
Yes.
but like you guys aren't on the same page.
Yeah.
They're just kind of like bland husbands.
Yes. So I am so happy you brought up Deborah Kerr. I love Deborah Kerr too. I think she's amazing.
Mhm.
And I know we were like texting one, maybe it was a couple of months ago when you were working on your big Deborah Kerr video. And everybody who hasn't seen the video that Izzy, go to Be Kind Rewind right now and watch the Deborah Kerr. You will not regret it. It's wonderful. But you told me that Deborah Kerr reminds you of Cate or vice versa. And I love them both, but I never made the connection. So I was just like, okay, I'm like, I'll have to get Izzy back on the podcast to ask her what does she see the connection between um, Deborah and Cate Blanchett.
I think it's something about their acting styles. Well, I should say like Cate has a certain kind of like seductive prowess that Deborah doesn't have. I think Deborah is like super hot and whatever, but like I just know that that's not her thing, is like smoking in a corner and being like,
That's not
giving
her.
someone the
Yes.
eyes. That's just not her.
Yeah.
Um
She's more earthy.
yes, she's very like sophisticated and like elegant, which is like Cate, but in a different way.
Yeah.
And but I think what it is like that sort of heightened naturalism. Like I've never watched a Deborah Kerr movie and been like, oh, I feel like I'm watching a documentary. You know what I mean? Like it's like a very theatrical kind of delivery where it's like a little bit extra, but
Mhm.
in a way that feels like you're being taken into her world a little bit.
Yes.
I also just think like Cate's filmography is really special because it's largely not like childish. Like her dramas are like very adult dramas that are like
Mhm.
very specific and like nuanced to within themselves, right? And like that's kind of how I see Deborah Kerr's filmography. It's they're dramas for adults. They're like romances, they're very internalized, they're very sometimes neurotic.
Mhm.
Um and they're interpersonal, which I think is also kind of Cate's work. Like Cate isn't really a political kind of actor, if that makes sense. Like I don't get the sense that she's out there to like make a statement every 2 minutes, although she is in some sense, but
Yeah, I mean, she's one of those actors that sort of maybe we don't know as much about her, which is great.
Yeah.
And I think of Deborah Kerr that way, like, and that's because obviously Deborah Kerr is not with us anymore, but like I know more about like Betty Davis and Joan Crawford and even Greer Garson, who is
Mhm.
completely forgotten these days, than I know about Deborah Kerr, even though I think I've watched as many Deborah Kerr movies as I've watched for Joan or Betty or all those other amazing actresses I love from that time. But maybe that's the connection that you mean.
Yeah. It's about the work. When you think about Deborah Kerr, you're thinking about her movies because she's not really a dramatic person.
Yes.
um,
Like, it's not that, not exactly scandals, but like, I don't know who Deborah Kerr was married to or what. And I know that Cate has been married to the same man since she started working. And that's all I know about him. And I think
yep.
maybe that's the connection. But you know a lot about, Joan Crawford and Coca-Cola and Betty Davis and Gary Merrill and all these other things that sort of adds to the screen persona. And you can't help but think of it.
Yeah. And I think that's also true. Like thinking about Deborah Kerr as being one of the first like major actresses to put on, or like British actresses to put on an American accent is really interesting because it's not like she was brought to America and sort of like trained into a transatlantic accent or anything like that. It's
Mhm.
she basically maintained her British accent for her entire career, except for when she's like Australian or like Scottish or in From Here to Eternity, like famously American.
Yeah.
Which I feel like really changed a lot, like opened a lot of doors and like set a new standard for how non-American actors were supposed to come here and sort of like interact with American culture in a post-war situation.
Yeah.
And I feel like Cate is like the result of that, right? Like every single thing she does is essentially either American accent or British at this point.
Absolutely. She hardly ever plays Australian, maybe
Mhm.
only a couple of times in all her career. And I think 80% of her characters are American, in fact, very distinctly American. Like sometimes she even goes to like a specific American sort of dialect, like in Blue Jasmine or Mrs. America or things like that. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the other David Lean movie that I watched to see if there are any influences was Summertime with Katherine Hepburn. And I can't say that movie sort of like has any connection to Carol at all, but there was one scene in it. And I thought of that. As I was watching, and there's a scene in the middle of Summertime. Summertime is the story about this woman who goes on vacation to Venice and meets this married man who she falls in love with, and the obstacle here is that they're married, but also she's kind of timid, Katherine Hepburn timid, she really sells you on that. But anyway, she's sort of timid, and there is a scene where she's trying to connect with him but she can't, and she's sitting in this cafe and the camera sort of starts on her face. He comes and says hello. She doesn't ask him to sit down with her, although she wants him to sit down. And so he leaves, and the camera sort of just goes from her face and it goes away until it becomes a medium shot, then a big shot, and so we see her whole body. And I was thinking like this is the inverse of the end of Carol, because in Carol it starts with the end of Carol starts with Carol in the distance with all these other people around her until it goes close, 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 until it's almost a close up to give us that smile at the end to all end and all ending.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know what I just randomly thought of? Would Katherine Hepburn be a good Abby? I feel like she would.
Yes, she would.
Like she's not a Carol, but she's kind of an Abby.
She is. I think she would be a great Abby, but it's just like Katherine Hepburn always is the center of her movies. I can't see her doing an Abby.
I know. This is just like my fan cast at this point.
Yes. I mean, if we're doing Carol around that time, let's just get Marlene Dietrich to play Carol.
Oh, 100%. Except her name would be Katrin or something, like to explain her accent.
She has to be an exotic European.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, it's so funny. So one of the other things that Cate is in movies right now with Nightmare Alley. And watching that movie, which is completely like tone and everything different from Carol, but they're kind of like it's in the 40s, Carol is in the 50s, like it's close. But I think it's the closest Cate's character there, Lilith, has looked like Carol. Like it's sort of like the blonde hair and the red lipstick. It's kind of Carol.
Yeah. When I first saw the pictures, specifically of her standing with Rooney Mara, I was like, I'm ready. Carol too. Carol too in Greenwich Village. They're thriving in the beat poetry scene in the 60s.
But it's not, because they only interact once. They have one scene together. So if you haven't seen Nightmare Alley yet, go see it. Cate is great, but just don't think of it as Carol too.
Yeah, sad. I wish it were Carol too.
So we talked about Deborah Kerr, and I've been reading sort of like just reviews of the performance, and everybody has to mention someone when they talk about Carol and Cate's reviews, and they have to talk about like who she is or who she reminds them of. I love that. I do that all the time, but sometimes when I'm reading it from other writers, and this is where my biases come out, and I'm just like, you just didn't think about this at all. You just looked at the movies from the 50s, and the first person from the 50s who came to your mind, you just put their name there.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I'm sure someone will hear me say like, oh, like Deborah Kerr, really? But I thought about this. Okay. If you watch like not the famous, not like the King and I, okay, you need to get into the filmography and it will make sense why I said that.
Yes. No, you explained it great. Like, I think people should go, watch your video about Deborah Kerr and sort of watch more Deborah Kerr movies. I didn't make the connection until you explained it to me. It is a connection that needs a little bit of explanation.
It's true. I think when you just watch enough movies, you realize like how horny all of her characters are. And then you're like, oh, it makes sense.
Yes. I mean, her most famous thing is that beach scene in From Here to Eternity, which is the horniest. I have to say, I love Cate, but she has never been this horny like that from Here to Eternity.
Rare. I mean, nothing is that horny anymore. It sucks. Yeah. Like even Nightmare Alley, which had every right to be super horny, was really not that horny.
No, it wasn't. I think that's what Nightmare Alley was kind of missing. Like for Stanton and Lilith to form this connection that makes them do all these crimes. Where is the heat?
Was it rated R?
I think it was rated R because it was because of the violence, but that was probably
it's like,
it.
If you're going to go there, I don't know.
I think actors don't want to do that anymore, even though Bradley Cooper is naked. He goes full frontal for a split second. But I think I remember an interview with Keira Knightley that I read maybe 10 years ago. And she talks about how the many porn sites since the internet, like she's somebody who started her career right before the internet porn proliferation. And then early in her career that happened. And sort of like she talked about how she decided not to do nude scenes anymore, because then everything is just put together and forever they are on porn sites. So I think maybe a lot of actors just don't want to do that anymore. And that's why there is no nude sex scenes anymore.
It honestly makes a lot of sense to me. And to be like, to their credit, like that the fact that Hollywood is just now getting around to having intimacy coordinators, I'm sure it's like very intimidating, or it has been in the past, So now I'm sure there's like growing pains figuring that out.
Yes. So one thing I want to talk about, like, Carol is a romance and it's a beautiful romance. And I think one of the things that I love about it, and it's a point I'm repeating myself, maybe I said it already, but like for romances used to need to be epic. Like if we're talking about David Lean, you think of Dr. Zhivago, which is like epic. It's not just about these people getting together, but it's about war and the Russian Revolution. And so, and so many things happen. Or even when you think about something like Anna Karenina, which is like the romance to end all romances. There are so many things happening in that book and in all the adaptations. But what I love about Carol is it brings it all down to just these two women. And what happens between them, it might not be a war, it might not be a revolution, but it feels just as seismic.
Absolutely. I mean, I think like thinking about Todd Haynes as a women's director, like the other person to famously helm that title is George Cukor.
Yes.
And like when we think about women's pictures in that context, it's exactly that. It's domestic. It's focused on very minute details. I mean, in a George Cukor movie, if you wear the wrong hat, your life might be ruined.
Yeah.
And that's like absolutely serious, right? Like to them, absolutely serious. But it's just something that like for most of history, we haven't taken seriously. So as like a society, but also on a smaller scale within film, if you look at like, for example, the Academy Awards are like an easy metric of that. Just like films that are about women's issues or women's lives, like don't win Best Picture because they're not important. They're not as like exciting or like high stakes as a war. So when you get a romance like Dr. Zhivago or something like that like does really well, you can kind of see it's kind of merging with other more quote unquote serious topics.
Yeah. And that's why there is that in the Academy Awards, there's always this connection between Best Actress and Best Picture. There's never a connection between those two categories.
And this year, none of the Best Actress nominees are in a movie nominated for Best Picture, right?
Yes. And I mean, I think
Wild.
it's almost every year, but maybe this year, it's like there's usually 1 out of 5 or 2, but this year is literally 0.
Yep.
I always discover things when I watch Carol. Like I watch Carol every time and I'm like, did I not see this scene before? It's like I called it the gift that keeps giving. So I want to ask you about some of your favorite moments and things that you have discovered this watch, especially if while you were watching it and thinking of it as like influences and inspirations, we can link to those movies from the time that the story takes place.
Yeah. I also just thought that one thing that Brief Encounter does really well toward the end, the second time we come back around to Celia Johnson's character, it's like you lose the audibility of the conversations happening outside of her mind. Like she hears the train and that's it. And that's sort of, I think, what Todd Haynes copies really well with Therese in the car. We kind of, everything kind of becomes hazy as we start to realize that we're moving into her perspective and also that we're about to go into the past of her perspective, which is a really cool tactic, I think, that he modernized a little bit.
Yeah, and also it just looks so gorgeous. Like the sort of flooding of the screen with the green color. It's just so beautiful. Yeah.
Beautiful. So I think my favorite line in the whole movie, and this is 100% because of how Cate performs it, is when Therese calls her and she says, I want to ask you things. And Cate says, ask me. So desperately performed. Like it's so vulnerable. And she just kind of like, it just pours out of her. Like she wants so badly to tell her everything. And she just needs the permission to do it. And that's like, I mean, that is the most relatable thing in the world of just like being so scared, but so ready for something to happen. And it's just so beautifully performed. And it's such a simple line.
Yes.
But like for her to pack such a punch with it is really extraordinary.
And it's also just the way she's shot, like she's wearing sort of a robe and her hair is covering half her face. And just as the camera's closing in and we can see her, but we can't really see her. But
and
still,
the cigarette is held so strangely.
Yeah.
Like it's like still very full, you know? It's very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Did it remind you of any of the actresses of that era, that sort of just that moment?
Deborah? No. But I mean, not wrong, but maybe. No, I don't know. I mean, I guess I wasn't thinking about other actresses in that moment because it's just like, how can you envision anything else
other than Cate,
like,
right?
Like it's just been like if it's already done perfectly, I'm like, I'm never gonna imagine this in another way.
Yeah. One of my favorite moments is like when Abby drops her off at that party early in the movie. And And then she's sort of like walking away and the camera's on her as she's walking away and she sort of like clicks her feet together. And it's just that little moment. And I feel like, I don't know, I feel like, you know, I'm a little obsessive. So I feel like that's just for the very few Cate fans that she's like giving us something. And sort of like it's not the same thing, but I feel like that, like the great screen actresses always sort of give you that sort of trademark thing. Like I think about it a lot with Meryl Streep, who is a great star, but she's also a great actress and she disappears into characters. But sometimes she will just like, whatever character she's playing, she will always touch her face. And I was like, oh,
the Debbie Reynolds. Yeah, the Debbie Reynolds thing.
Yes. Signature Meryl moment. And you're just like, even if you are sort of lost with her in The Hours or in Sophie's Choice or whatever, you're just like, oh, Meryl, this is for the fans. This is for the true ones that know.
I'm so curious about like certain moments and like their intentionality with things. Like there's, okay, you know, when Carol's boyfriend, Richard, I keep thinking, I'm like, Jake Lacey, is like waving goodbye and he's like, have fun. And Carol like salutes him.
Yes.
And she's like, I'm about to fuck your girl. Yeah. But she like she does a very specific, like 2-finger, like salute. Right.
Yeah.
And every time I'm like, that's Marlene Dietrich does that in Morocco.
Oh yeah, totally.
And I'm like, did you do that on purpose? You know what? Like, is it a callback? Because that's like one of the most iconic, like queer performances ever. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I mean, knowing Cate and how she knows films and film history and how she's somebody who sort of like uses all the tools, I can't think of it as something that just happened. I think it's probably calculated. Yeah.
It feels so specific that it feels intentional and like learned rather than, because I've never seen her do that before in another movie, I don't think. You know?
Yeah, and I mean she does that, and I think in sort of like especially when she's playing somebody from an era that's not modern, like I think her Cinderella is completely a homage to Joan Crawford. And I think what she does in like sort of like she's doing the comedy Joan Crawford. And I think what she does in Nightmare Alley is a lot Lauren Bacall. Especially like the voice and sort of like the movements, and when she stands up and sits down, I'm like, oh my God, that's Lauren Bacall. And actually, the first time I saw Nightmare Alley, I didn't realize the Lauren Bacall thing until a very nice listener, Meryl, sent me an email. She's like, oh, I heard you talk in the podcast about who, and she's like, it's Lauren Bacall. And then when I watched it again, I just couldn't take Lauren Bacall off my mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice. Like, if I'm thinking about actors who can handle a femme fatale role right now, like there aren't very many, because we aren't asking people to weaponize sexuality anymore, really, in film. Yeah. And that's in a way what she does in Nightmare Alley and Carol. Because like essentially, I mean, like Top Energy like is weaponizing sexuality.
Yeah, totally.
But like but it's kind of like weaponized in different ways, where in Carol it's kind of like a benevolent like love, whereas it's obviously not in Nightmare Alley. But it's interesting to see how she can kind of use that in different ways and kind of manipulate that skill.
She also does it in Ocean's 8.
Yeah, totally.
So Cate, keep weaponizing your sexuality because we love watching it.
Yeah. You have fans. You have lots
of them. Izzy, you mentioned Mae West. Was there a moment that reminded you of Mae West?
Yeah. I mean, speaking of weaponizing your sexuality, when she says, invite me around, I was like, oh my God, why don't you come up and see me sometime? It just made me laugh watching it again.
Another famous blonde.
The emotional impact of the film has now settled in, so I can kind of find things funny. So, for example, when Harge asks Carol, he's like, "Oh, how'd you meet this one?" And she's like, "Oh, I left my gloves and she returned them." And he goes, "Oh, that's bold." I honestly like fell out of my chair. Like it was so funny. Like just imagining how intimately aware he is of like how what's the right word? aggressive, but in it like in not in a bad way, she is really funny to me. That's so funny.
It happened before. He's not surprised.
Yeah. He's like, oh, what a strategy you've conceived. Excellent work. It's so funny. And you just kind of get an insight to the things that she probably has done in the past, which are, I'm sure, amazing.
I always think that sort of like the hard sort of like that moment, I'm glad, we can think of it as funny now, because I think when the movie was first out, like a lot of male critics didn't connect as much with this movie. And I think it's maybe because they found Harge a little put upon. Like, I'm not going to call names, but I remember I got into a fight with some male straight critic who was like talking on Twitter about how the only performance that works in this movie is Kyle Chandler, which I'm like, are you what? Like, I can't believe it.
Rude.
So.
The other line that made me laugh this time, which like I plan to meme in some capacity, is when she's leaving and she's like, "We are not ugly people, Harge." And I'm just like, "No, you're not. You're not ugly. You're both very beautiful."
Yes. Maybe the most beautiful.
Yeah. Like it's just so funny because like I know what it means. I know. And it like the first time I watched it, I did not think it was funny. But now I'm just like, it's funny because you're both just so hot. It's like not fair. It's really funny.
Yeah, totally. And that scene is sort of memified, I think, so much because when she sits down and she puts her hand on her heart and she's trying to like explain that she's willing to give up Rindy, like that's the gay shaking meme now. And it's so funny to me. And exactly. I use that all the time, even though the moment, to your point, like that is a moment where she's giving up her daughter. And now people are just like gay shaking.
Yeah. And well, we messaged about the other one where they're at the table. And when she tells Teresa she loves her, it's literally the like, do you want to, I don't know, like live together? JK, unless maybe,
would you?
JK, unless you, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's very funny.
I mean, I think this is a great thing in that the more you watch this movie, that your relationship with it sort of like evolves. And now you can enjoy it for what it is, sort of realistic love story with lots of stakes, but also like find all these moments, which are literally these people are putting their lives right in front of us, but you can still, because we have a relationship with the film, you can still find it funny. And
absolutely. I mean, it feels, that's exactly what it is. It's a relationship with the movie. Like, I mean, how many times have something horrible happened to you and then a week later you're laughing about it because it's just a funny story now? I mean, that's just how it feels with this movie, having lived through it so many times.
And maybe that's why Carol endures.
True. Absolutely.
As usual, Izzy, this has been a wonderful conversation. I think we touched on a lot of things, and I thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You are one of my faves to talk to, and, I could talk to you for another hour.
Thank you. I could too.
But before we go, let our listeners know where they can find you and your work.
Yep. I'm on YouTube at Be Kind Rewind. I'm on Twitter at BK Rewind and Instagram BK_Rewind, I think.
And you can find me on Twitter at ME_says and follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at Sundays with Cate. And until next time, thank you for listening.